Moral argument against moral realism. One of the central questions in metaethics is the following. Is what we morally ought to do ultimately a function of our actual moral judgments or determined independently of them? Moral anti-realism is the view that what we morally ought to do is ultimately a function of our actual judgments. That does not mean that there is a one-to-one correspondence between moral truths and our judgments. It does not mean, for example, that murder is wrong because we think murder is wrong. Stealing is wrong because we think stealing is wrong. Or this particular action is wrong because we think this particular action is wrong. But rather that anything that is right or wrong is right or wrong ultimately because we approve or disapprove of something. What many people find appealing in anti-realism is its metaphysical and epistemological economy. Anti-realism attempts to account for moral discourse on the basis of naturalistic states of mind, such as approvals, disapprovals, or plans, which are relatively easy to make sense of from a scientific point of view. Nonetheless, anti-realism is often considered to have a fatal flaw. If what is right or wrong is ultimately a function of what we think is right or wrong, as anti-realism claims it is, then even the most reprehensible things such as genocide, slavery, and torturing babies for fun, these are the examples that the critics of anti-realism usually give. Those are not my examples. So even those reprehensible things would be permissible if most people approved of them. But surely, the objection goes, genocide, slavery, torturing babies for fun would be wrong even if everyone approved of them. A world in which most people approved of genocide and slavery would not be a world in which those things were morally permissible, but rather a world in which most people were morally corrupt. Many philosophers believe that the only way to avoid that kind of objectionable permissiveness that anti-realism leads to is to postulate the existence of a moral reality that exists independently of what anyone thinks. This postulation constitutes the core of moral realism. The kind of moral reality posited varies from one version of realism to another. However, all realists believe that, one way or the other, an independently existing reality is the ultimate source of all moral truth. To emphasize, what draws people to moral realism is typically the conviction that a moral reality that exists independently of what anyone thinks would provide a firm ground for morality, if we could philosophically account for it, that is. However, that is where the view gets into trouble. A realm of distinctively moral properties, which endow certain actions with an intrinsic to-be-doneness, is argued by many to be too queer to be tenable. That's John Mackey's term. The current predicament in metaethics, therefore, seems to be that we must choose between simple and plausible metaphysics and epistemology, coupled with an objectionably permissive ground for moral truth, that's anti-realism, and a firm ground for morality, coupled with questionable metaphysics and epistemology, which is realism. In the rest of this essay, I will basically challenge this picture. More specifically, I will argue that, contrary to the widely held assumption, moral realism does not constitute a firm ground for morality. In fact, it constitutes a substantive moral mistake. So let me start by articulating what I mean by substantive moral, because that's going to be crucial for my argument. Suppose someone, call him A, shot and killed someone else, B. Suppose that it was B who shot at A first, but then A shot back and killed B. In other words, A killed B in self-defense. Now, the first obvious substantive moral question is whether what A did was morally wrong. For the sake of argument, let's assume that A's action was not morally wrong. It was morally permissible. If someone judges, therefore, that A's action was not wrong, then he delivers the correct overall moral verdict about the action. However, there is more to moral deliberation than correctly determining that something is or is not wrong. There is also the determination of why it is or is not wrong. In our case, for instance, if someone claims that A's killing of B is not morally wrong, so far so good, but that it is not wrong because the action took place on a Tuesday, because as we all know, everything is permitted on Tuesdays, then someone who says that clearly fails in his moral evaluation of A's action. Why questions, therefore, constitute the heart of substantive moral deliberation, and they come in various degrees of generality. I have hinted that A's killing of B was not wrong, it was permissible, because it was self-defense, and not, for instance, because it took place on a Tuesday. For the sake of argument, let's assume that this is so. The killing was not wrong because it was self-defense. Now that we know why A's action was not wrong, we have a deeper moral understanding of it than when we merely judged it to be not wrong. But we can do better than that. We can ask a why question about self-defense. Why does the fact that A's killing was self-defense count against its wrongness? Why does it make it permissible? Or in other words, why does self-defense matter morally at all? At this level of generality, we may turn to the so-called theories of normative ethics. For instance, classic utilitarianism tells us that an action is right if and only if it maximizes total happiness in the universe, pleasure minus pain. Utilitarianism thus supplies us with an answer to our last why question. The fact that A's killing of B was self-defense matters morally because it makes a difference to the total pain produced by the killing. Killings in self-defense, a utilitarian could point out, lead to less pain than killings for other reasons. By contrast, according to the Kantian ethical theory, an action is permissible if and only if its maxim can be willed to be a universal law for all rational beings. The Kantian view would thus also answer our question regarding the moral significance of self-defense. The fact that A's killing of B was self-defense makes a moral difference, according to the Kantian, because it makes a difference to the universalizability of A's maxim. Killing to save one's own life, a Kantian could point out, passes the universalization test, whereas killing for another reason might have failed it. The point is that abstract theories like utilitarianism and Kantianism provide answers to the fundamental substantive moral question of why right things are right and wrong things are wrong. And in that sense, they amount to general substantive moral claims. But we can go even further than that. We can ask why questions about utilitarianism and Kantianism too. Why does, if it does, the universalizability of the maxim of an action render it morally permissible? Why doesn't, given that it doesn't, the fact that an action maximizes total happiness in the universe make it right? In fact, we can ask the ultimate why question. We can ask, in the end, why is anything the case morally? We may, I suggest, see moral anti-realism and moral realism as competing answers to that ultimate why question. Anti-realism states that anything is the case morally, ultimately because we judge it to be the case in some way. Realism, by contrast, states that anything is the case morally, ultimately because an independent reality dictates that it be the case. Since these are answers to the fundamental substantive moral question of why right things are right and wrong things are wrong, anti-realism and realism, just like utilitarianism and Kantianism, amount to very general substantive moral claims. Now let's turn to the evaluation of these substantive moral claims. As I have mentioned at the beginning, the standard objection against anti-realism is typically formulated in terms of counterfactuals. Imagine, we're asked, a possible world in which most people approve of genocide. In such a world, would genocide be morally right? Surely not. But anti-realism, the objection goes, implies that it would be right because anti-realism makes the wrongness of genocide, like the wrongness of any other thing, ultimately dependent on our actual disapproval of it. Now, anti-realism does seem to give the wrong result with regard to that counterfactual scenario. But how does that show that it constitutes a substantive moral mistake, as I claim that it does? Substantive moral views, as I've explained, have to do with the reasons why things are right or wrong. How does a counterintuitive result concerning counterfactuals translate into a mistake about the reasons why things are right or wrong? Thinking in terms of counterfactuals, I think, is a helpful way of testing substantive moral views. For instance, we may intuitively test the view that everything is morally permitted on Tuesdays by asking, what if such and such, a particularly horrible action, happened on a Tuesday? Would it be right? Or we may test a view like utilitarianism by asking, what if such and such, something very demeaning done to an individual, say, what if that brought about more total happiness in the universe than any other alternative? Would it then be morally okay? However, helpful as it is to use counterfactual language, when we test a view from a substantive moral point of view, we must not lose sight of the fact that we are testing it with respect to what it says about the reasons why things are right or wrong, rather than what it might say about some metaphysical dependency relation between states of affairs. If we are asking, for instance, whether a genocide would have been morally permissible had it maximized the total happiness in the universe in order to test the utilitarian view from a substantive moral point of view, we are not really asking about the metaphysics of some possible world, a world in which that particular genocide maximizes the total happiness, but rather whether some actual aspect of that genocide, namely that it did not in fact maximize the total happiness in the universe, is part of the reason why it was wrong. The substantive moral question, in other words, is really a moral relevance question about the actual world. Formulating it in terms of counterfactuals is a rhetorical tool. Consider the following. 2 plus 2 equals 4. So that's a necessary truth, let's assume. So there is no possible world in which 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. Suppose, however, that someone claims, just to help me illustrate my point, suppose someone claims that the ultimate reason why anything is morally right or wrong is that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So according to this person, genocide, slavery, and torturing babies for fun, to use the standard examples, are all wrong ultimately because 2 plus 2 equals 4. It is an absurd moral view because clearly that mathematical truth is not morally relevant to the wrongness of any of these reprehensible actions. It is not among the reasons why these actions are reprehensible. We could express our objection to that absurd moral view by employing counterfactual language, asking, what if 2 plus 2 did not equal 4? Then genocide and slavery would be right. If that question is effective intuitively, it is, I believe, because it is another way of asking, what does that mathematical truth have anything to do with the wrongness of genocide or slavery? It would not work as a question involving the state of affairs in the possible world in which 2 plus 2 did not equal 4, because there is no such possible world. Thus, sometimes we use counterfactual language in order to question the moral relevance of a fact in the actual world. And when we do that, we do not presuppose that the fact in question is contingent, because whether or not it is contingent has nothing to do with whether or not it is morally relevant. In raising the standard objection to anti-realism, therefore, by asking, what if most people approved of genocide, would it then be morally right? We do not have to rely on the existence of a possible world in which most people approve of genocide, even though that assumption would be unproblematic. So this point is going to be important when we discuss realism. The presumption in questions like, what if most people approved of genocide, would it then be morally right, is that surely it would not be morally right. The real target of my argument here is realism, so I will essentially take it for granted that the critics of anti-realism are right here about the moral irrelevance of our actual disapproval of genocide. That's not that's not the main thing that makes it wrong. What I would like to suggest now is that a very similar case can be made against realism. Moral realism, the realist Ross Schaefer-Lando writes, quote, is the theory that, so moral realism is the theory that moral judgments, when true, are so independently of what any human being anywhere in any circumstances whatever thinks of them. At the simplest level, all realists endorse the idea that there is a moral reality that people are trying to represent when they issue judgments about what is right and wrong, unquote. Realists differ greatly in their understanding of moral reality. Some claim that it is a distinct realm of non-natural properties and states of affairs. Others claim that moral properties and states of affairs are identical with certain natural properties. And recently, there have been others who insist that an independently existing moral reality is not supposed to be understood in metaphysical terms at all. For the purposes of this essay, these differences in the metaphysical construal of moral reality do not matter much. What I would like to do is leave aside all metaphysical and epistemological issues surrounding a moral realm and evaluate the very idea of an independent moral reality from a solely substantive moral point of view. I have argued that realism amounts to the following substantive moral generalization. A wrong or right action is wrong or right. I'll just speak in terms of wrong actions, but whatever I say applies to right actions as well. So this is realism, I have argued. A wrong action is wrong, always ultimately because there's an independent reality that dictates that it is wrong. The moral bottom line for realists, in other words, is always the dictate of an independent reality. Now recall that the problem with anti-realism was that it made the wrongness of anything, even the wrongness of such reprehensible things as genocide and slavery, always ultimately conditional on our actual disapproval of it in however complex ways. But notice that realism does something very similar. It makes the wrongness of anything always conditional on the existence of a dictate from some independent reality. Accordingly, we may ask, what if genocide and slavery involved all the pain and suffering that they involve, but there were no independent reality that dictated that they were wrong? Would they then not be wrong? Isn't the proper thing to say rather that genocide and slavery would be wrong even if there were no independent reality that dictated that they were wrong? But we may wonder, does that question even make sense? Moral reality, one may say, exists necessarily if it exists at all. Furthermore, moral truths are themselves necessary. Hence, one may argue, the question, what if there were no independent reality that dictates that genocide and slavery are wrong, is misguided because it rests on the false presupposition that it is contingent whether or not there's an independent reality dictating the wrongness of genocide and slavery. In fact, one may go on, that is precisely how realism differs from anti-realism. It is a contingent matter whether or not most people actually disapprove of genocide, whereas it is necessary whether or not there's an independent reality that dictates that genocide is wrong. As I explained when we were discussing the objection against anti-realism, however, when we evaluate a view from a substantive moral point of view, we are concerned with the reasons why things are right or wrong, not with what is possible and what is not, even though we may employ counterfactual language. The what-if questions, if they're intended to challenge a substantive moral view, do not presuppose anything about possible worlds, simply because whether something is possible or not has nothing to do with whether it is morally relevant or not. Necessary things may be as morally irrelevant as contingent things. Hence, when we ask, what if genocide involved all the pain and suffering it involves, but there were no independent reality that dictated that it was wrong? Would it then be morally not wrong? In order to evaluate realism from a substantive moral point of view, what we really ask is whether it makes moral sense to take the dictates of some independent reality to be the ultimate reason why genocide is wrong. Realism, I would like to suggest, holds independence from our opinions in such high regard that everything else, including what really makes things right or wrong, diminishes in importance. The moral import of anything, even the pain and suffering that genocide and slavery involve, becomes dependent on one condition. It has to be ordained by a source that exists independently of our opinions. Realism implies that what is really wrong with genocide is that it is somehow judged to be wrong independently of us. But surely being not us can't be that important. In conclusion, so does moral justification, we are often asked. This is a quotation from Nagel's book, The Last Word, quote. So, does moral justification come to an end with objective principles whose validity is independent of our point of view? Or do they come to an end within our point of view, individual or shared? So that ultimately, even the apparently most objective and universal principles derive their validity or authority from the perspective and practice of those who follow them, unquote. I have claimed that it is a mistake to think, as anti-realists do, that moral justification always comes to an end within our point of view, that conformity to our judgments and opinions is always the ultimate reason why right things are right and wrong things are wrong. I have claimed, in short, that anti-realism is a mistaken substantive moral generalization, and it must be rejected. Is the rejection of anti-realism the same as the endorsement of realism? The rejection of anti-realism means that moral justification doesn't always bottom out at conformity to our actual judgments. For instance, when we morally analyze A's killing of B in our example, we can say A's action was not morally wrong, and it was not wrong because it was self-defense. Self-defense, in turn, counts in favor of the permissibility of the action because it renders A's maxim universalizable, and it is morally permissible to act on maxims that one can will to be universal. If we are then asked, but what about the last thing you said? The Kantian claim that it is permissible to act on maxims that one can will to be universal. Why is that true? Because we think it is true? If we reject anti-realism, as I think we must say, no, universalizability of a maxim doesn't render an action permissible because we think it does. Does that mean that we are now realists? If realism is just the rejection of the universal moral generalization, that the ultimate moral justification is not always conformity to our judgments, then yes, we are. However, realism, as it is commonly understood and defended, is not just the rejection of a universal generalization, but the endorsement of another universal generalization. Realists claim that in order for there to be genuine wrongness and rightness, it is morally necessary that there be an independent source that issues moral verdicts. They think, in other words, that nothing can be genuinely wrong unless it is wrong independently of our judgments. Now, when realism is understood as a universal generalization like that, we do not necessarily become realists just because we reject anti-realism, for the simple reason that rejecting one universal generalization does not commit us to another universal generalization. Hence, just because we deny that the moral bottom line isn't always conformity to our judgments, doesn't mean that we must accept that the moral bottom line is always independent of them. I have provided reasons for rejecting the realist idea that conformity to an independent source is always the ultimate reason why right things are right and wrong things are wrong. Therefore, just as we reject anti-realism, we must reject realism. So how do we answer Nagel's question? Does moral justification come to an end with objective principles whose validity is independent of our point of view, or ultimately even the apparently most objective and universal principles derive their validity or authority from the perspective and practice of those who follow them? The thing is, this question presupposes that the fundamental principles of morality, which account for why right things are right and wrong things are wrong, after all, must in turn be justified by either our judging them to be true, or their being somehow judged to be true by an independent source, however thinly the latter is understood. It presupposes, in other words, that what matters most in morality is either our judging something, or it's being judged for and independently of us. But we can reject both of these alternatives, and in the light of the objections against both, I think this is what we must do.